Okay, I think we're just getting the room set up and a handful of people are still joining us. We'll start our book forum in another 45 or 60 seconds. Thank you to everyone who logged in and is joining us for a conversation with Todd Myers. Like I said, we'll kick off in just one moment. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kent Lassman. I'm the president at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I want to welcome all of our viewers for another of CEI's book forums. Today, I'll be joined by Todd Myers. He's an expert in environmental policy. He is the author of a brand new book out this week called Time to Think Small: How Nimble Environmental Technologies Can Solve the Planet's Biggest Problems. He comes to us with more than 2 decades of policy experience. He's been a leader at the state of Washington's Department of Natural Resources. He lives in the heart of the Cascade Mountains with more than 200,000 honeybees. He is part of the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, and he works day to day with our friends at the Washington Policy Center, where he's the Environmental Policy Director. As a reminder, we want to get you involved in this conversation. For our friends joining live, I encourage you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to enter questions. Those will be sorted and fed to me, where we'll get them in front of Todd so that we can talk about your ideas and your questions. For those of you that don't have that access, you can try to send an email to events@cei.org and we'll get them in the queue. For those of you watching on YouTube or C-SPAN's book notes, welcome back. We're very happy to have you. This entire conversation, as well as all of CEI's programs, are available online at cei.org under the tab labeled Events. So Todd, welcome to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm really happy to have you with us. I'd like to kick off with what I hope is the easiest question for any book tour, for any author, and that is to tell us about your book, what catalyzed you to write it, and what are you hoping to get across?
Well, thank you. It's really nice to join you. CEI, I really appreciate the work that you do. I have been a fan and worked with your staff for a very long time, more than a decade. And the thing I like about CEI is that they are tenacious at fighting bad environmental policy. And unfortunately, and I think in the world of policy, bad environmental policy has become synonymous with environmental policy. And so that's why I wrote my book, is because I've worked in environmental policy for more than 2 decades, as you mentioned, at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources on issues like old growth, forest health, spotted owls, all the sort of the big issues. And I got frustrated that what I saw happening with environmental policy is that so much of our policies are made based on politics and making politicians and people feel good about themselves rather than the things that actually were most effective. And so there was a lot of symbolic things that were done for the environment. And I think that's why folks on the center right are often frustrated or sort of nervous about engaging on the environment, because they're worried that environmental policy has become synonymous with big government. And that we need to change that. And in fact, what you see is that every day people on the center right live surrounded by the environment. If you look at a map, right, where are the red parts of the map? The red parts of the map are where the nature is, and where the blue parts of the map tend to be urban areas. So how can we do that? How can we express in policy the care that we have and to be good stewards of the environment in a way that isn't just contributing to big government? And so that's why I wrote my book, Time to Think Small. And Time to Think Small is about small efforts rather than big government, empowering people, not politicians. And so what you see around the world are that you give people, we have now had the technology to give people the power to do things that are really effective for the environment, that are more about results than symbolism. And I'll just give you a very quick example. Whatever people talk about climate change as if it's the only environmental issue, but clearly it's not. And one big issue that I think everybody agrees on is trash in the ocean plastic, and the desire to keep plastic out of the ocean. And the United Nations signed an agreement earlier this year, and they're still trying to figure out what to do. Some states, like Washington State, have banned plastic bags in the hope that that will help. But that's not really the problem. The problem is primarily in developing countries. And so a group called Plastic Bank started hiring people in places like the Philippines, Brazil, Egypt, to collect plastic. And they could show where they'd collected it on their phone because they have a geolocation, GPS. And then they would give it to Plastic Bank, and they get paid on their phone because often they don't have bank accounts. And then the plastic is recycled and sold to SC Johnson. So when you go to the store and you buy a Windex bottle, it'll say made with ocean-bound plastic. Now, none of this technology is particularly, difficult, but 93% of people in developing countries have cell phones. But just using this very low-tech, very simple, small efforts, they have collected more than 3 billion plastic bottles that would have washed into the ocean, and more than 140 million pounds of plastic. So more than governments are doing just with these simple technologies. And I think it's a fantastic example of how thinking small approaches empowered with technology are doing more than government approaches.
There's a lot there, but let's see if we can set the stage for folks, because we skipped over the last 50 years, right? So the plastics example, I think, is very illustrative, and it's helpful for people. You give a little bit of history, and maybe you could explain for our audience the environmental consciousness and therefore environmental policies that followed. It follows a natural progression. Some 100 years ago, there was an upsurge in interest in preservation. About 50 years ago, we focused on source point types of regulation and pollution. So that where the big problems are, we look at those places and we create rules around them, rule-bound responses. So with the plastics, we have plastic flowing into the ocean. We're not talking about how it gets there, whether it's coming out of a dump or falling off a ship or whatnot. We're talking about the solution side of it, which is not big regulatory central command answers. It's markets and volunteerism and connecting people through technology. Could you walk us through kind of these, what are all the moving parts here? Because we've got regulation of central regulators, we've got cleanup efforts that are small and personalized. It seems like we need to name all of the pieces.
Yeah, so that's great. So one of the things that I say, and I sort of hinted at, that people are concerned that environmentalism has become synonymous with sort of big government solutions. And in many ways, we're stuck in the 1970s with how we think about environmental problems. And as you pointed out, the problems that we faced in the 1970s with air and water pollution primarily were point sources. They were big smokestacks. They were big outfalls, right? The Cuyahoga River catching on fire, those sorts of things. And targeting and solving those problems, government is actually pretty good when there are a very limited number of sources and they can focus on those and have a big impact. And that was what we saw in the 1970s with the creation of the EPA and those two laws, was that it did actually make our air cleaner and make our water cleaner because they could focus on a few sources. Our problems today are very different. They are distributed. There's lots of small sources. And so what we do today has to be different. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can actually take the word of Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first director of the EPA, who did, who sort of first implemented a lot of these laws. And so actually from my book, I'll just read, he wrote a great column about 10 years ago where Ruckelshaus said, yesterday's solutions worked well on yesterday's problems, but the solutions we devised back in the 1970s aren't likely to make much of a dent in the environmental problems we face today. And so we have to change our mindset to deal with the types of problems. Lots of little bits of ocean plastic, lots of people using energy and having small impacts. In Puget Sound, where I work on salmon, one of the biggest problems is simply tire rubber, little bits of tire rubber that go into the water. And if you try to do the same kind of top-down 1970s approach to those problems, you're not going to have success. And that, in fact, is what we're seeing is that a lot of those problems are not being solved, which is why a lot of the people on the environmental left are turning to these sort of distributed, technology-based, innovative solutions. There is still an instinct, I think, among many to turn to government, but when they really want to solve them, we're finding that innovation and technology is the answer, not those big government programs from the 1970s.
And just for a moment, unpack for us what you mean. It's right there in the title, and you've made some references to geolocation and mobile phones and whatnot. When you're talking about information technology, it's more than a supercomputer that fits in your pocket, right? We're talking about hardware and software as well as distribution. So hundreds of millions of people empowered. Help us understand that a little bit more.
To your last point, like I said, 93% of people in developing countries have some kind of cell phone or smartphone. And so the ubiquity of the technology is simply part of it. The supercomputer in your pocket is a big part of that as well. Just being able to communicate and collaborate with people immediately in a way that simply didn't exist before. To use sort of Ronald Coasian language, the transaction costs are very, very low to collaborate. And so you can do things that only government could do before. But it's not just cell phones. It is smart thermostats that use artificial intelligence to help you conserve energy in ways that you don't even have to think about. In my electrical panel, I have a little orange box called a Sense Monitor that connects to the electrical wires in my house, and 1 million times a second detects what electricity is coming into my house to determine what kind of appliances I'm using and where I'm using electricity, and then gives me the information so that I can make those sorts of decisions. So the fact that technology has been so made so easy to develop and is so ubiquitous, not just cell phones, but lots of other things, has given us lots of new opportunities to solve problems and do things that only government could do 10 years ago because the transaction costs of collaboration or information were so high, they just weren't available.
So let's see if we can work through a couple more terms. As I read through the book last week, or in the last week, I kept underlining and circling terms. I thought, well, I know what that means. But then I would come, 3 or 4 pages, and I would have a much deeper understanding. So why don't you tell us, what is citizen science? This is something that's been percolating around in magazine articles for 2 decades, but you're talking about it in a very real now sense.
Yeah. So citizen science, people talk about it now because it's real, right? You actually can do a lot of things in citizen science. And it's basically it's a combination of 2 things. One, people providing data that previously was not available. So just to make a tangible example, for people who are birders, they probably use eBird. I use eBird. And eBird is just an app where you put in the birds that you have seen, where you saw them, and when you saw them. All of that data, though, goes to Cornell University, their ornithology program, and they are now able to use that data to determine bird migratory patterns and do a variety of cool things, both scientifically and for habitat preservation.
So citizen science is much bigger than a 3rd grader with a tin pan in the backyard collecting water, right? Precipitation rates.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's funny that you mentioned that, because one of the best citizen science programs on the web is called SciStarter, where it has a long list of citizen science programs. And the woman who created it, Darlene Cavalier, was doing citizen science programs for kids. And she's like, hey, I want to do it. I want to find ways to help out. And so it expanded, and technology has allowed us to expand it. But it's not really a new thing. Aldo Leopold has a wonderful essay from 1943, the great conservationist Aldo Leopold, what he calls wildlife sports. And what he says is, like, amateurs become interested in different animals, learn about them, and then become experts in them. They are not, sort of credentialed PhDs. They are just amateurs who are interested in it. Of course, in 1943, we didn't have the technology that we have to share that science and share that information in a way that we do now. But it's not a new concept. It has just been made very powerful with the technology so that simply putting birds into an app contributes to scientific research.
So let's stick with Cornell. I've gone to their webpage over the years too. They also have a library of bird calls. So you can listen, not just see on a map where birds have passed through or where they're found or the population density, et cetera. What's to keep the accuracy high? You know, when they hire graduate students, they send them out into the field with some hiking boots and a pair of binoculars and a notebook. They're counting on the graduate students to being honest. But in Northern Virginia, if I go in my backyard, I go to Birder and I say I saw a penguin, you know, it goes into the database. What are we doing? What do we do about that sort of problem with citizen scientists? Maybe not malicious, but people make errors.
Right.
They think they saw a rare bird when they did not. How is that accounted for?
So there's a variety of ways. So one, you mentioned bird calls. One of the things that eBird does now is if you hear a bird, you can actually press a button. It will record the bird and identify the bird for you, which is really cool. But let's say you are certain that you have seen a penguin in Northern Virginia. When you go into eBird, it knows where you are, and it'll say, here are the birds that you could have possibly seen. So first, it simply says you can't see a penguin. It will tell you, it won't give you that list, but you say, nope, I saw a penguin, and you put it in. Cornell has millions and millions of bits of data that they collect. And so if among those million bits of data is one sighting of a penguin, they know that it is anomalous. So there are a variety of layers of protection that they can use by using this data, both first by narrowing it down based on what they already know, but then by determining whether the sighting is anomalous. And if all of a sudden 200 people in Northern Virginia see a penguin, it either means that climate change has really done something strange, or they need to call the local zoo because there's a penguin loose. But unless they see those 200 hits, they're going to say, this is a mistake.
So they have parameters they can set for error rates to try to track that down. What you mentioned with the Leopold article, a concept that I think is all around us and people are aware of, but they don't think hard about what it can do for science. Can we talk a little bit about gamification? I've been taking my kids hiking since they fit in one of those little backpacks, you know, since they're about a year old. And it dies off, I will tell you, at least in my household, in their early teens when they don't want to spend time alone with their father. And it came back for my oldest daughter when she got into geocaching.
Yeah.
Right? So she started collecting badges for finding geocaches. What is the badges and the tokens and the numbers? How does this all contribute to science as opposed to just being a distraction for us?
Yeah. So one of the challenges with eBird and other things like that is that people see a lot of birds where they live, where they like to hike, where there are pretty views, but in the middle of the forest or off the beaten path, they don't have very many sightings because it's hard to get there. And so if you're just an amateur birder, you're going to stick by the road. And so there's a thing called roadside bias. So they have a lot of data in some places and very little in others. And so just like geocaching, they have a thing called avocaching, where you go out and they say, look, we need to do sightings in this area. And if you do sightings in those areas, they will give you points. And then you can get rewards like hats and shirts and, just prestige.
Prestige among your community, your self-selected, voluntary, private association community.
That's right. So, what happened, like I said, the cost of collaboration is now so low that even if you're not part of a birding group, you are still part of a birding community online on eBird. And if you can score points to show that you are one of the top birders in Northern Virginia, that's pretty cool. People like that. They respond to that, in addition to sort of the fun little trinkets. But it is a way to supplement the basic citizen science data where people are going out in their normal places and getting the data that they need. But there's one key thing, which is, and this is a key to gamification. Initially, eBird was built as a system where they would say, here's the data we need, go get it. But what they found is that it is better to tell people, you do what you want and work with them and reward the people using the app rather than treating them just as graduate students going out into the field. And that becomes more effective. So consumer response, rather than sort of top-down mandates, is what makes eBird really work. And I think it's a metaphor for the types of things that I'm talking about, helping the environment from the bottom up rather than the top down.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I may even be borrowing words from your book. But it seems to me what you're describing is programs that solve a problem of the citizen or of the consumer, as opposed to just solving the problem of the regulator. So the problem of the consumer might be they have trouble keeping a list of all the birds they've seen, or they might have trouble identifying a bird. So there's attributes of the app that help them with their problem, and then it grows from there. Then it becomes useful or marketable in the community. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. And I think that is a key to making environmental action resilient and sustainable. If your environmental policy is contingent on the next election, if it is contingent on sort of forcing people, either through regulations or taxes or other things, to do what you want, they may revolt. They may say, no, I'm not going to do that. Or they can be undone at the next election. But if your strategy is to say, look, I'm going to help you see the birds you want to see, get prestige. I'm going to help you save energy. Whether or not you're concerned about climate change at all, those things are durable, right? You're not dependent, doesn't matter what the election results are. You're going to keep saving energy, electricity, because you want to pay less no matter who is elected. So that consumer focus is what makes environmental efforts at this sort of small level durable for the long run, rather than the political instability that we see, which goes back and forth. And that's why I think it's just fundamentally a better approach for the environment than relying on politicians to do the right thing and relying on election outcomes.
Before we get more into these policy applications, just one more question, or at least one for now, to stick with birds. There's a non-governmental solution that we can read about in your book that deals with migratory patterns. And again, you brought up this notion of a Kosian bargain. So a large NGO goes to farmers and says, we want habitat, but we don't want habitat year round. We only want it as the birds are passing by. Right. Could you talk a little bit about that program, that project? Because I think it's really illustrative of, again, solving a problem for the farmer or the landholder, instead of just saying from a top-down place, we want access to the land and we don't want it used for any other source or any other activities. How did that work out?
Yeah, and it is a very Kosian approach. So using eBird data, because so Cornell University now has like millions of bits of information. So they know very precisely where migratory seabirds are traveling. And what they were able to do in the Central Valley of California is to say, okay, these are the plots of land where they pass over. And if we could turn those farms into habitat, it would really help them along their way. So the Nature Conservancy used that data, went to those farmers and said, look, in January and February, we want you to flood your field to, however many inches of water, because it will improve the habitat for those birds as they travel. How much would it cost? And they did a reverse auction. And the farmers said, well, if you paid me this, I will do it. And so they went ahead and did that. And they called it,
Go ahead. And I'm sorry, I want to explain for just a moment, or ask you to explain. A reverse auction means the farmers are not bidding against one another necessarily. They're just saying how much it's valuable to me.
Correct.
Right.
That's right. So they say, look, It's going to cost me something to do that. I might lose a little bit of time in planting, but if you paid me this amount of money, it would be worth my while. And Nature Conservancy said, great, we'll do that. And that habitat is valuable to us because we have the scientific data, right? They have the certainty that habitat will be valuable, and so they're willing to pay it. And the farmers now have certainty that they will get revenue, and that is worth their time. And so they called it pop-up wetlands. Some people referred to it as Airbnb for birds. They use it for just a very short period of time, right, on their migratory route. Nature Conservancy pays for it, essentially rents the habitat for a short period of time, and then the farmers later can go do what they want to do. But it is the combination of the citizen science data collected because we now have the technology and this Kosian arrangement where each side says, here's how valuable it is to me, and then there is an agreement made, and it was a very successful result. And you contrast that with the Endangered Species Act,
right,
which uses regulation to force people to do things, which makes the bird or animal a liability on their property. This makes the bird and animal an asset. It's just a more powerful way to engage private landowners to help provide that habitat for whatever species you're trying to protect.
Okay. I have a long list of questions for you, but I see we have our first question from the audience. So I want to get the audience involved as a reminder to everyone else. If you have questions, please use the function at the bottom of your screen labeled chat, and we'll get those fed into the conversation here. Our first question comes from Abby, and she asks if you have any ideas about how your strategies could assist with efforts to reach the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Follow-on question, which we can explore. So, what do you make of international regimes like these?
Yeah.
So let's start with the easier one. How can nimble environmental technologies affect CO2 emissions?
So I will set aside the 1.5 degree target because people have big fights over that and whether it's worth the cost. So I will just address the question of how can these sorts of approaches, reduce CO2 emissions rapidly and effectively. The first thing, though, I think is that there is an assumption in these questions that the Paris Climate Accord and other things like that are effective. And I find that simply not to be the case. The UN actually put out a report recently basically saying that we are nowhere close to meeting the 2 degree target, let alone the 1.5 degree target. So, countries have promised that we're going to meet these goals. Many of them don't even have plans that can meet those goals, let alone the actual implementation. Here in Washington State, our governor talks a lot about climate change, is considered a climate leader. We have missed every single one of our CO2 targets. And in years when it was supposed to be going down over the last 8 years, CO2 emissions have been going up. So I think the first thing we have to do is recognize that there is a lot of false promise and a lot of false hope in turning to governments that they can achieve these, because the history is they don't do it very well. But we do it because we don't think there's an alternative, right? We feel like it's the only hope.
And yet, you talk about how we take cars off the road.
Right? Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, but there are lots of cool things where we can apply technologies, and that's a great one. So I'll mention that one. So there is a really cool company called Pantonium that is in Canada, but is now working with cities in the United States that is trying to change transit, and it's not just small buses; it's macro transit, and what they call it is on-demand macro transit. And so rather than a normal transit system where you have these sort of static routes that go around, they're allowing people to say, okay, here's where I am and here's where I need to be by this time. And it uses an algorithm to create the bus route on the fly. So it knows where to pick up the people and get them to where they need to go. And not only is that more effective because people then have certainty that they can get where they need to go, but it is very effective at reducing gas use and carbon emissions. So it saves money for the transit agency, and it is less impactful, because what would happen with the old routes is that you would go long periods of time where nobody was picked up, but you had to go the route. With on-demand, they simply say, no, there's nobody over here, so we're just going to cut this off. And they found that it saved gas, cut CO2 emissions, and was more effective. And the number of people who rode transit went up radically, because they knew exactly that where it was going to go. Again, consumer friendly, appealing to the consumer, saving energy, and reducing CO2 emissions. But it doesn't even have to be that sort of big sized. It can be very personal. In the UK, there is a utility called Octopus Energy, that their focus is getting people to move to renewable energy. They specifically say, look, we want people who are concerned about climate change. But one of the key ways they do that is that they charge market rates. As the rates go up in the evening, they charge higher rates. As the rates go down at night, they charge lower rates. And in fact, there was even a windstorm where there was so much wind energy in the UK, they actually charged negative rates in the middle of the night and asked people to use electricity. The beauty of that is that what they do is they give people tools to shift their demand outside of those high cost periods, which saves them money. But those periods of time are when you typically have to turn on natural gas and coal and things like that. So it's the most carbon intensive. So you can simply say, instead of washing your clothes during peak hours, which is also the most expensive and carbon intensive, wash it at 11 o'clock at night when it is less expensive and you're using more renewables. Now, again, you don't have to worry about climate change at all to find that attractive, because you're going to save electricity. So those are the sorts of things that I think can be more effective over time with small incremental, and making it available to everybody to reduce our CO2 emissions and meet whatever target we determine is appropriate, rather than just relying on politicians in the hopes that they will meet the targets, which history says they rarely do.
There's a further example that I think would be worth explaining here. You know, in the late 1970s, President Carter went on television and encouraged people to wear a sweater, turn the thermostat down.
Yeah.
Now we can use a phone to program an AI system. The AI system will help us decide when to turn the thermostat up or down, because sometimes we want to preheat or pre-cool the building, given the external forces. The sunlight is going to come during midday. So if we're going to want to cool it down, maybe we want to cool the house down earlier in the day. How does all of that technology interact with day-to-day life? You mentioned that you use this in your house for electricity. Are you getting pinged 10 times a day on your phone that you need to adjust things? How convenient or inconvenient is this if I'm not an ultra passionate penny pincher saver when it comes to my electric bill?
Yeah.
I am, but again, the people I live with are teenagers, so I don't win this battle. What does it look like from the consumer side?
Yeah, it can't be that, right? It can't be that you're getting notifications 10 times a day, because people will simply turn them off and they won't use them. You need help to find ways to save electricity without it having to be omnipresent. But the first thing is that we just need to have a sense of what it costs us. If I ask people, what does a kilowatt hour cost? They don't know what a kilowatt hour is, and they certainly don't know what it costs. If I ask you, what does a gallon of gas cost? Everybody can tell me instantly what a gallon of gas costs, because it is everywhere. And so the first thing technology does is provide you a sense of, look, here's how much money you're spending by leaving lights on or doing this or that, which they don't have now. The second step is the one you refer to, which is how do you deal with that in a way that is not that is inobtrusive, that is not pressing on you. And that's what artificial intelligence does, is that it says, look, I know the artificial intelligence, which I'm now making sentient, says I know when when rates are high, when you're in and out of the house, and how to make you save money. And the other thing is that it's voluntary. It's not imposed. So I tell this story, and there's always people who come into me in the audience and say, I do not want a smart thermostat knowing when I'm in and out of the house and, controlling my thermostat and other things like that. And I say, great, you don't have to do it. The trade-off choices are yours to make. Whereas with top-down policy, those trade-off choices are made by someone else. And so I think that is why people on the center right can really embrace these sorts of things, because it allows them to save money, to be efficient, to let market forces work without it being imposed. And they can say, I'm not comfortable with this, but I am comfortable with this, and make their own choices.
And so let me try to unpack for just a moment. We've used back and forth here, and I have the benefit, unlike most of our audience, of having read the book. But we keep talking about artificial intelligence. Is it fair to, if we were to substitute really, really powerful pattern recognition instead of something that is a little bit mystical, a little bit scary, sounds a little bit like HAL 2000?
Yeah. That's exactly right. It's not, yes, I don't want HAL 2000 in my house. But something as simple like on the Nest, if it's connected to your phone, you can do that. And then when you're out of the house, it'll say, oh, you're out of the house. You don't need the house at 72. You can have the house at 63 or something like that and save electricity that way. So sometimes it's as simple as that. But in other cases, it is pattern recognition. Oh, I know that you usually get home about now and you want it here. But there's some really cool things that it will do on top of that. So let's say it knows that at 5 o'clock you're coming home, but that at 5 o'clock rates start to go up. What Nest and other smart thermostats will do is that they will precondition your house. At 3 and 4 o'clock, they will get your house up to temperature or even slightly above temperature when rates are low, knowing that your house will be able to maintain that temperature simply by holding the temperature because of the insulation during the period of time when rates are high. So you are still comfortable, still get the temperature you want, but you have done it in a way that reduces your costs, not because you had to think about it, but because the pattern recognition understood that and helped you become comfortable at a lower cost.
So let's explore the incentives here for just a moment. And I would, for a moment, let's set aside the incentives of government regulators, our state utility commissions and lawmakers and whatnot. The utilities, one might think, want me to heat my house at the last possible moment when the rates are the highest, right? Because that's where they're going to get their marginal revenue and marginal profit. What incentive do the utilities have to encourage these sort of smart technologies, whether it be for water or electricity or other aspects of what you're talking about?
So in some cases, utilities don't. Where there is a regulated monopoly, there is this tension. And what regulators do is they say, okay, you have to prove that you have helped consumers save. You have to provide rebates for energy efficient water heaters, things like that. And so it's mandatory where there is a regulated monopoly. But where there aren't regulated monopolies, like in the UK, like Texas and other places, you see different business models that are aligned with these technologies. And so, for instance, there is a utility in Texas where you pay them a flat fee. And what they do is they provide you electricity that is reliable, but it is upon them to try to find you reliable electricity that is the lowest cost. And if you want renewable energy and other things, amenities like that, they can provide that. So their incentive is to make you happy as a customer, and they get a flat fee. And they are very aggressive about helping you find technologies like smart thermostats and other things like that to reduce your costs. So you do, in some cases, need a different business model. You talked about incentives. The incentives have to be different, but technology has made those business models possible, and they do exist in places like Texas, the UK, and elsewhere, and you are starting to see those, which align environmental concerns with price.
And what would be the next step? How would we adapt the practices. We talked about the business practices, trying to solve the problem of the consumer, make them happy. What is the next step for evolving the role of the regulator? One might think that we need fewer authorities sent to central regulators at that point. How does that change? Where's the regulatory state in this mix and mash of citizen science and evolving technologies to address environmental concerns?
So the question is, how do we get from here to there? And that is a difficult question, right? But I think, again, you can make it incrementally. And what you find is that when people are given a little bit of power, a little bit more control, they don't want to give it back. The regulators try to claw it back, but they start to put pressure on regulators to give them more options. And I'll give one of my favorite examples from Seattle. So I'm in Washington State. Seattle has a majority socialist city council. And so in about 8 years ago, they put a hard cap on the number of Uber and Lyft drivers that could be in the city. 2 weeks later, there were so many people in the council chambers, Uber drivers, Uber riders, and others, that they immediately rescinded it and gave an unlimited amount of Uber and Lyft. Now, even in Seattle, where the council is socialist, where the mindset is very far left, they had to respond to people who had been given more power and control and given more choices. And so that, I think, is the power of these technologies, is that it is very hard to see how do regulators respond? They're going to want to try to keep their power. But when you give people power and options, they want to keep that, and they will put pressure on regulators to provide more of those things. So there is no straight path, to be certain, but the only path that is really possible is if you give people the power and they exercise it, which we see that they already are.
See, I'm in favor of creating a reward, a bounty, for any legislature that puts regulatory commissions out of business. I think we need to align their incentives, but we might run afoul of some ethical concerns with that. Let me switch gears first.
I think the word incentive is better than bounty, but anyway.
Let me switch gears for just a second. We haven't talked as much about species preservation, but there's this wonderful anecdote that I think sets the imagination running. And I was hoping you could tell us about turtles and international poaching rings. How does that unfold, and why does that matter? And what are the implications for other environmental questions?
Yeah. So sea turtles across the globe are threatened and endangered. And one of the biggest problems is poaching of turtle eggs. Turtle eggs, people eat them. They're a delicacy. In many cases, they're not for subsistence, but they are sort of like a bar snack. But they are valuable. And poaching a clutch of turtle eggs can be very valuable to people, especially in places like Nicaragua. So when turtles come in, they dig a hole, they lay their eggs, and the poachers grab those eggs and then will sell them. So there's a wonderful group called Paso Pacifico that works in Central America, and they have worked with what they call turtle rangers to go to the poachers and say, look, do you know the impact that you're having? And the poachers will say, yes, I understand, but I got to feed my family. And so they actually know the poachers, but what they were interested in is like, who's paying the poachers? What are the networks? Because those are the people that we need to get to. And so they had a revelation when they were watching actually Breaking Bad about tracking a shipment. And so they said, I wonder if we could do a tracker. So they created.
Again, this is all private, right? This is private association. This is an NGO.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is not an NGO with 1,000 people, right? This is an NGO with a limited number of people and a limited number of turtle rangers working on the beaches. And so technology was the way that they could multiply the power of their efforts because they don't have 1,000 people. So they created a small turtle egg. They actually printed it with a 3D printer. They made it feel like a turtle egg, sort of soft, and they put a tracker inside that could be tracked by a cell phone. And so the purpose is that you could see it go from one place to another. And so they actually had a woman who was getting her PhD test this in Costa Rica, and they put these in turtle clutches. Her name is Helen Feasy. I talk about her. And she was putting all these eggs in, and they were having no luck. But finally, on the last night, she said she almost didn't even go out. One of the eggs was poached. And she said she sort of felt funny about celebrating poaching a turtle egg, but it allowed them to test the technology. And what they found is that the egg went all the way across Costa Rica and was sold in sort of the back alley of this grocery store, and then was taken out into neighborhood to be sold door to door. And they were able to see exactly where the poaching ring, sort of how it worked. But again, that small, simple technology made on a 3D printer, just with technology that's available basically everywhere, magnified the power of this small organization to understand poaching rings and fight turtle egg poaching. And it's being used in the Caribbean, and it's going to be used. And others have talked to them about using it for different types of poaching.
So this is the logical extension, it sounds to me, of private conservation with the overlay, excuse me, the overlay and application of information technology, the 3D printing, the geolocation of the false egg, etc. Why is it that regulators, I can imagine a scenario where at the EPA, if you brought them a proposal to put something inside a endangered turtle's nest, they would have conniptions. They'd send out troops to arrest me before I even got down to the beach. Why is it that regulators can't adapt to the success stories, even when there's proof of concept? What's standing in the way there?
I think there's a variety of things. First, one of the things you see is that these technologies are developed often in developing countries, where government simply is not an option, or government is the enemy. In fact, government puts troops in Nicaragua, or did put troops with AK-47s to stop poachers. But what's happened is that they just get bribed. And then folks up the chain get bribed. And so now government is actually in some ways complicit with the poaching because they have been paid off. And so one of the lines I have in my book is that small technologies are more powerful than AK-47s, because the people with the AK-47s can simply be bribed. And so that's part of the answer is that rather than just focusing on the US, in developing countries, you see a lot of these technologies substituting either for government, the lack of government ability, or government corruption. In the United States, I think that we have to be more creative about these things. Having worked in government agencies, the people who work there are convinced that what they're doing is the right thing. And they do many good things, but government is not innovative, and government moves very slowly. Technology moves very fast, and the problems, environmental problems, often move very fast. And so there is just a mindset change. The very first thing that has to happen is a mindset change, to recognize that these tools are available. And so in the case of Seattle, permissionless innovation comes in and changes the entire environment, and government sort of scrambles to keep up. And so one of the reasons I wrote this book is just to get people thinking about environmental solutions in a different way, so that we can find the answers to regulatory problems, so that regulators aren't just saying, no, we're not going to change, we're going to do it the same old way. We're going to try some of these new things to see how they can help. But I think it's any effort to change those regulations has to start with a recognition that these alternative approaches are valid, which I think is sometimes challenging.
So early on, we talked about some of the foundational federal laws here in America. They deal with species, and they deal with pollution. Two areas of environmental regulation that have a lot of activity, a lot of regulatory engagement with the private sector and the way we live our lives. There's a third area, and I wonder if you could explore for us where one of these technologies, or there's a line of thought about new technologies coming online, could help with safety regulation. Water comes to mind when it comes to environmental safety, but I'm sure there are other examples. Is there an example that you'd like to share about regulating toward safer environments
Yeah.
and what we can learn from these new technologies and how to apply them.
So one of the examples that I give in my book about this very area about water safety is the Flint water crisis. We just saw a situation in Mississippi. Washington, D.C. has had water health problems. But in the Flint water crisis, the government, they changed the source of the water, which caused lead and other things leaching into the water, and it made the water very unhealthy. And what you saw in that situation is both the state of Michigan and the EPA were very slow to respond to, I mean, people were literally holding bottles of water that they had gotten from their tap that were brown. And yet the government, the state and EPA were saying, well, we're looking into it. We think it's still safe. People were dealing with it every day. And the most dramatic moment for me was that there was the EPA was talking, once they recognized that there was a problem, they said, well, maybe we can buy filters for folks. And they had a pot of money that wasn't designed for that, but they sort of said, maybe we can justify it. And there was an email in the regional EPA office from one of the administrators who said, yeah, we could use it for this, but it would be, it would be unusual. And the quote was, and I'm not sure Flint is the kind of community we want to go out on a limb for. So for those who think that the EPA is always out there to help them, recognize, in Flint, they failed badly. And those are the sorts of failures where they didn't want to take a political risk for the community as people were suffering. But there are obviously technologies, filters and other things like that. And there are monitors that can show that the water had lead in it, that the water had other problems. In fact, the problem was initially identified not by government, but by researchers who saw it. And so all of those small private technologies both were what detected it and ultimately what could have solved it. And then, of course, while the water was being changed back, it was private companies with bottled water that came in and fixed it. And just to put a sort of the cherry on top, people said, okay, well, what about all those plastic bottles that were used? There is actually a group that crowdfunded in Flint that took those plastic bottles and turned them into glasses. And so even the low cost using crowdfunding, the low cost of innovation dealt with the environmental problem of the plastic bottles.
Right.
So Flint
Your
is just a
pollution
great
becomes
example.
my manufacturing input, right?
That's right. So Flint, I think, is a great example of government failure and innovative environmental solutions.
So throughout the hour here, we've been talking about these technologies combined with wide distribution, many people having access to them through software, through hardware, through their phones, whatever it would be. It's helping collect information. It's helping aggregate information. It's helping analyze information. That's the software side of it. And now you're talking about there's a monitoring function for ongoing activities, right? And this is where the safety kicks in.
Right.
All of this sounds very familiar to anybody who's studied economics, but I think what you're telling me, and I'm just going to ask you to reiterate before I get to our next question, these are all normal things in the marketplace, right?
Yeah.
If I go out to sell lemonade at a lemonade stand, these are the sorts of things I'm thinking about. It's not necessarily a normal thing for a regulator to be thinking about information collection, aggregation, analysis, and monitoring. They're thinking about legal analysis. They're thinking about rules and things of that sort. Is that fair, or am I being unfair? Am I wearing ideological blinders there?
Well, but I think that there is, obviously government does collect information, but when government collects information, it uses information to try to make decisions or figure out how it can achieve the goals it wants. There are two aspects of it. I think that there is a legitimate aspect of it, which is collecting information to make better decisions. I am not an anarchist, despite the fact that I live near Seattle. So I don't think there is no role for government. And I do want public policy people to have the information necessary to make better decisions. And if they're making mistakes, I want to make that clear. So some of that information collection is valuable. But some of that information collection is about how can we nudge people in the direction that we want them to go and is not their choice. And that, I think, is they have a lot of that information. We don't. Citizens sometimes have less information about themselves than the government has about them. And I want to change that power imbalance, that information imbalance, to give people the information so that they can make their own choices rather than government having, the majority or even a monopoly of the information.
And this might feed right into our last question from the audience. Monroe asks about Nest and other similar products. Specifically with Nest, it's a product of Google.
Right.
Google is in the business of data capture, and they make sales based on that business. And
Right.
there's a lot of consumer distrust related to privacy risks associated with those technologies. So this brings us to the question, how would you calm the fears of that marginal consumer that's not sure if they want the technology in their house?
Right.
Or do we think that perhaps it's just an inevitable conflict that, if you don't want all of your data flowing out of the house, this is just not going to work for you?
I think there's two answers to that. First, I will say that I'm a technology geek, and I live a semi-public life. So I am less worried about these things than others, and I recognize that my privacy, right, that there's data that companies have on me that would definitely make other people uncomfortable, which is why it has to be voluntary, which is why there has to be a consumer focus. And part of that consumer focus is saying, we're going to respect your privacy. We're not going to sell your data. We're not going to use it in ways you don't want. And, monitoring that and determining whether whether they live up to that, I think, is a challenge sometimes. But Google has a reputation because people are frustrated with the way that they use that. And that has become, I think, a challenge for their business model. But if you don't want a Nest thermostat, or you don't want a Sense monitor in your house like I have, or other things like that, you have that choice. And I think that's great. Whereas with so many government programs, you don't have that choice, which is my second answer, which is there is always going to be a trade-off. And one of the things, so I see from time to time articles about that when there was an energy crisis in California, that people's thermostats were automatically turned down 2 degrees or turned up 2 degrees, depending on the weather. And people are like, this is very intrusive. I don't like this. How is it that you can reach into my house and turn my thermostat on? And I agree. And what's interesting is that many cases people actually signed up for it, but didn't realize it, which gets to sort of the monitoring and, issue. But the alternative is that government simply turns your lights out. If there's a blackout, they can do that. And so, yes, I don't want government or others reaching into my house and forcing me to turn down my thermostat however much, or limiting how I use electricity. But they can already do that. And I would rather sort of a surgical approach to the meat axe approach that government already has. So in some ways, there's no perfect answer. Well, a lot of ways, there's no perfect answer, right? But the question is, you have to choose, you pick your poison. And I think that turning down thermostats and actually getting a reward, saving a little money for doing that, even if it's intrusive, is better than government simply coming and turning your lights off, which in California, they're facing more frequently because of those government rules.
Okay. We're going to have to start the wrap-up process. I do have a couple questions for you very quickly before we do some administrative work. I want to remind, or at least share with the audience, one point that I very much hope to talk about is a favorite economist who is underrated and underappreciated, gets a great deal of discussion of her ideas, and that's Eleanor Ostrom. So please check out Todd's book, Todd Myers, author of Time to Think Small, How Nimble Environmental Technologies Can Solve the Planet's Biggest Problems. Before we leave and lose you for the afternoon, Todd, 2 quick questions. Anything that we missed that you wanted to make sure the audience heard? And what are you working on now that you're so excited about?
Well, we've covered a lot. And I think the message I just want to reiterate is that conservatives and people on the center right who care about the environment every day in their lives, they're hunters, they go fishing, they go hiking, they live around the environment, see the environment as a policy issue as uncomfortable because they're worried of the implications. But these sorts of options allow conservatives to engage on both policy and environmental solutions in a way that fits their values and also crosses party lines. Many of the stories in my book and the foreword is actually written by a woman from Wild Labs, which is a project of the World Wildlife Fund. There is a lot of agreement about how we can solve environmental problems using these tools. And so I just want to encourage people on the right who care about the environment to engage on these things. And we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and every Thanksgiving there are these articles about how to deal with your, uncle, your crazy uncle, about the environment. Basically, people like me is who they're talking about. And what I hope that my book can be is give people some tools and some answers, and maybe even give it to your favorite college student to say, look, here is a better way to solve these problems that is more effective and achieves the same goals that we both want. So one of the things that I talk about with conservatives all the time is to have confidence on the environment, that the solutions that work in so many other areas also work for the environment, and not be afraid of this discussion. And what I'm working on, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's make sure that we tell people what you're working on at the Washington Policy Center.
Yeah, so we work primarily on Washington state issues, but a lot of things that start in Washington state get spread to the rest of the country. I think as tough as it is to live in Washington sometimes, there's no better place to be on the front lines of, especially in environmental policy. And so WashingtonPolicy.org is where I write. You can find me on Twitter at WAPolicyGreen, and you can see what's happening here before it reaches the rest of the country in many cases.
I want to thank you very much, and I'll remind everyone that if you know someone, an environmentalist. They don't have to be a hiker or somebody that goes out on the sea or a hunter. Anybody that cares about clean air, clean water, the world around us, that's a person we can call an environmentalist, and many of them find themselves politically in the center or on the right. Reminder to everyone, as the program wraps, we will cue a very short 90-second feedback survey. That's very important to us. We've read that information. We've been talking for this whole hour about information loops and how to learn and improve. And that's exactly what we're doing with our programs at CEI. I hope that you'll take a moment to fill out that survey. I've been speaking to you today from the Fred Smith Communication Studio in our offices. However, our next events hopefully will be coming to you in about a week and a half when I am in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for the UN climate meetings, where I'll be a delegate with some of my colleagues. We have some interviews lined up with federal policymakers and hope to talk to you more about climate and other issues throughout the coming year. Thank you all, especially to Todd Myers, and we look forward to seeing you next time.